A bold executive makes the wrong assumption in a high-stakes boardroom. But the real story begins when the power shifts without warning. Let us know in the comments section below where you're watching from today. The polished leather of his shoes squeaked just slightly as he stepped into the marble lobby, flanked by two junior associates, half his age and twice as nervous. Richard Langston didn't just walk into buildings, he conquered them. At least, that's how he saw it. He carried himself like a man who'd never been told no in a language he couldn't buy. The doors to the 28th floor conference suite swung open, letting in the soft hum of muted voices and espresso machines. A temporary reception desk had been stationed outside the boardroom, right in the merger's neutral zone. It was the kind of place where fortunes shifted with the stroke of a pen, and today, Richard fully expected to leave with even more control than when he arrived. He glanced around at the setup. Executives from Sterling Federal and Dominion Trust were still trickling in. Everyone looked sharp, nervous smiles, tight handshakes, firm nods. It was the language of corporate chess. And then he saw her. She sat alone at the corner of the long, oval table, back straight, calm as still water. Her outfit was elegant but understated, a navy blue suit, minimal jewelry, tablet open in front of her. She wasn't fumbling with notes, not whispering with anyone, not asking for coffee. Just sitting, watching. Someone new? Richard leaned toward his assistant, Connor, who blinked once, confused. "I think so. She didn't come with us. Maybe a secretary from Dominion?" Connor offered. Richard chuckled under his breath. "Well, she's parked herself at the table like she's running the show." He wasn't subtle. As he passed her seat, he tapped the table twice in front of her and said with a patronizing smile, "The refreshments are out in the lounge. You might want to grab them before the real folks start working." She looked up at him, didn't blink, didn't frown, just smiled once, faintly, as if she'd already done the math in her head, and decided he wasn't worth recalculating. "Thanks," she said softly. He moved on, convinced he'd just done someone a small favor. Behind him, Madeline Vaughn returned her attention to her tablet. The display glowed softly with the agenda she herself had approved 2 days ago. She wasn't Dominion Trust's secretary. She was Dominion Trust. Or rather, soon, they'd all be hers. But that revelation didn't need to come just yet. Across the room, a few others had taken note of her presence. Marcia Delano, VP of Strategy at Sterling, eyed Madeline with an inquisitive frown. She didn't recognize her either, but the way she held herself, the precision of her posture, it wasn't administrative. Not to mention, no assistant comes in without a notebook. Still, in a room full of high-earning suits, it was easy to get blurred into the background if you weren't loud. Or white. Or male. At exactly 9:00 IEM, the head of the Interim Merger Committee, a wiry man named Carl Jennings, stood at the head of the table and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being on time. This is a historic week for both institutions. And I want to be clear, we're here to build something better, not just bigger. You'll see today's agenda on the board." A digital screen lit up behind him, displaying a schedule broken into 6 segments. Madeline scanned it calmly. All in order. Each line had passed her desk for final approval. "Before we begin, I'd like to introduce someone joining us today on behalf of the holding company that facilitated the merger." A brief murmur went through the room. Richard, casually sipping his imported espresso, didn't look up. Carl continued, "Miss Madeline Vaughn, Executive Chair of Eastgate Financial." Silence. Madeline stood, and it was as if oxygen got sucked out of the room. Her presence, once so easily dismissed, now snapped into focus like a lens being adjusted. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. Richard coughed lightly, the espresso catching in his throat. His face drained a shade. Madeline offered a gracious nod. "Good morning. I won't take much of your time now, but I'll be observing today's discussion closely. I trust we'll all act with the professionalism this opportunity deserves." Then she sat. No notes, no hesitation, no doubt who she was. Carl, flustered, hurried to regain his footing. Right. Yes, well, let's proceed. First item, leadership integration structures. The conversation moved forward, but the current had shifted. For the rest of the morning, Richard didn't say much. The man who barked commands and cracked smug jokes now leaned back slightly, as if reassessing everything. Twice he tried to meet Madeline's eyes. Twice she didn't give him the courtesy. Because respect isn't owed, it's earned. And Madeline Vaughn had earned everything that brought her to that table. By 11:15 a.m., discussions had turned to overlapping branches and workforce redundancies. The mood was tense. A few whispered side conversations broke out. She's the Madeline Vaughn? She's worth how much? Eastgate owns us now? But Madeline never once raised her voice. She didn't need to dominate the room with volume. She did it with presence. By the time the meeting adjourned for lunch, Richard was visibly shaken. He lingered behind after most of the executives had exited for the catered buffet in the lounge. He approached her seat like a man rethinking everything he'd just said that morning. "Ms. Vaughn," he began, voice slower now, I don't believe we were properly introduced." Madeline didn't look up from her tablet. "I believe we were," she said calmly, "but thank you for your follow-up." Then, with the poise of someone used to this moment, she stood and left, leaving him behind. Like a footnote, like a correction at the bottom of the page. The sound of polite laughter filtered through the glass walls as lunch unfolded in the executive lounge. Silver trays of catered hors d'oeuvres sat untouched by some, devoured nervously by others. Everyone was playing it safe now, every word measured, every glance calculated. And somewhere beneath it all, a low hum of confusion buzzed around Madeline Vaughn. People who had dismissed her just an hour ago were now eager to circle back. A few even made clumsy attempts at flattery, suddenly remembering times they may have heard her name in passing. But Madeline wasn't interested in correction. She was studying them, memorizing behaviors, tracking who adjusted their tone and who stuck to their subtle patterns of condescension. A woman like her, black, powerful, youngish. She'd learned a long time ago that forgiveness was often weaponized against her. She didn't need apologies. She needed leverage. Marcia Delano caught up with her near the coffee station, a paper cup cradled in both hands like a peace offering. "I owe you a better hello," Marcia said with a dry chuckle, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I've read about you in Forbes. Didn't expect you'd be in the room personally. I assumed, well, that I'd send a man." Madeline offered, without offense. Marcia winced, then nodded with a small laugh. "I didn't say it, but yeah." Madeline raised an eyebrow, amused but not unkind. "That's all right. I like to see things for myself, especially the foundations. Mergers are like homes. Everyone wants the design, but nobody checks the pipes." Marcia relaxed a little, leaning slightly closer. "You'll find Richard's plumbing rusted through if you ask me." Now that earned a small smile from Madeline. Back in the boardroom, the air had shifted. Gone was the breezy arrogance from the morning. Chairs were filled with straighter backs. Laptops clicked with more purpose. Even the assistants in the back corners seemed to type more attentively, sensing the temperature change. Carl cleared his throat again, he seemed to do that a lot, and tried to restart with the same enthusiasm as earlier. "Welcome back, everyone. Let's move into the strategic placement discussions." Richard spoke up almost immediately, though his tone had dulled from confident to cautious. "Before we do that, I'd like to revisit an item on the leadership slate. I think we should have a conversation around who's sitting where, especially as we finalize the joint leadership board." He paused, glancing quickly at Madeline, then away again. "Titles can be flexible in these situations," he added. "And there's value in rewarding those with tenure." Madeline didn't respond. Not yet. Carl nodded slowly. "Sure, that's valid. We had slated a shared leadership chart pending Eastgate approval, but we can table that for a moment. No one missed the irony. Richard shifted in his chair. I just think, in a merger like this, senior experience matters. Dominion's done very well with its regional growth, and, despite 2 consecutive SEC investigations, Marcia cut in dryly, not bothering to hide her boredom. A soft chuckle from one of the junior VPs made Richard flinch. We were cleared, Richard snapped. But you were investigated, Madeline said quietly. Her first words since lunch. The room froze. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't leaned forward, but she had spoken, and suddenly every eye turned toward her. You were investigated twice in 5 years for regulatory missteps. The fact that you were cleared doesn't make the scrutiny go away, she continued. We deal in perception just as much as performance, and perception is what shareholders buy. Carl adjusted his collar nervously. Well, yes, I mean the point being, we want to reassure all parties that we aren't here to reassure, Madeline said firmly. We're here to lead. She closed her tablet. A soft click echoed through the boardroom like a gavel. You all had weeks to study the proposed integration structure. It was reviewed by internal audit, compliance, and HR across both banks. Richard, I understand your concern, but if this board is going to succeed, it has to be built on earned trust, not familiarity. Richard sat back slowly, his lips pressed into a thin, wordless line. Madeline looked across the table. If there are specific data points or achievements you feel were overlooked, you're welcome to present them now. Otherwise, I recommend we move forward with the current slate and stop wasting everyone's time. The silence stretched just long enough to sting. Then Carl, grateful for the out, clapped his hands awkwardly. Well, then, let's proceed. The meeting regained momentum, but now it was different. Madeline wasn't the mystery in the corner anymore. She was the axis around which everything now turned. Afterwards, as executives filed out of the room, conversations rippled quietly. No one looked at Richard. A few nodded respectfully at Madeline. Marcia, without a word, gave her a small thumbs up. Outside in the hallway, Connor hesitated by the elevators, unsure if he should say something. Richard eventually joined him, cheeks flushed and jaw tight. She humiliated me, he muttered. Connor didn't reply. Richard shook his head. She planned this. She came in knowing, let me embarrass myself. Connor finally spoke. With respect, sir. You did that on your own. Down the hall, Madeline walked calmly toward the lobby, her phone in one hand, a quiet smile forming on her lips. This wasn't new to her. The power games, the underestimating glances, the backpedaling apologies. It was the same ladder she'd been climbing her entire life. Only now she was building the damn thing herself. And when you build the ladder, you choose who climbs, and who never makes it past the first rung. The glass walls didn't just reflect sunlight, they magnified discomfort. In the hours following the leadership discussion, the Sterling Dominion merger team worked in quiet disarray, each department siloed into smaller breakout rooms on the upper floors. Faces buried in spreadsheets, consultants whispering at whiteboards, mid-level execs trying to pretend they weren't shaken. But under the gloss of business as usual, everything had shifted. People were no longer trying to impress Richard Langston. They were trying not to offend Madeline Vaughn. At the heart of this subtle upheaval, Madeline remained composed. She'd kept her seat at the table but barely spoke during the afternoon sessions. Her silence wasn't emptiness, it was weight. It made every glance from her meaningful, every nod deliberate, every note she typed carried the subtext that it could become policy. By 3:15 p.m., the legal team was deep into operational risk reviews when Madeline finally stood and excused herself. She moved through the hallway calmly, her heels clicking softly against polished tile. She entered an unused conference room, closed the door behind her, and finally allowed her jaw to tighten. She didn't sigh. She didn't sit. She just stared at the window, and took in the skyline. It wasn't the first time she'd had to navigate a room filled with men like Richard, men who talked in percentages but thought in prejudices, men who smiled too wide and assumed too much. But today wasn't about hurt feelings, it was about systems, about rebuilding the spine of an institution, and people like him, they were used to being the bones. Her phone buzzed gently. Text from Madeline Vaughn. "How's it going? Did he say something slick? You want me to slash his tires?" Madeline smiled. She didn't respond, not yet. Instead, she opened her contact list and dialed someone else. "Franklin," she said when the line picked up, "how close are we on the internal compliance audits from Dominion?" There was shuffling on the other end, the sound of paper and fingers tapping keys. "Close," Franklin said, "but some departments were dragging. I think they knew what we'd find." Madeline stared ahead, her voice crisp. "Then push harder. I want an executive summary on my desk by morning. Pull their expense reports too, if there's anything off, anything. It needs to be cleaned before this board gets stamped." She didn't have to say what she meant by cleaned. Franklin knew. So did half the team she'd brought over from Eastgate Financial. They weren't here to inherit a mess. They were here to decide who got to stay in the room when the doors locked behind them. By the time she returned to the main boardroom, a different meeting was underway. This one wasn't on the agenda. 3 of Dominion's senior leaders, including Richard, were seated with Carl and 2 sterling board members. No assistants, no screens, just closed folders and hard stares. Carl stood awkwardly when he saw Madeline enter, mid-sentence. "Oh, Vaughn, we didn't mean to exclude you." "You didn't," she said coolly, walking to her seat. "I was just making a call." Richard looked like he'd bitten into something sour. The others shifted uncomfortably. Carl cleared his throat again, voice trying to stay upbeat. "We were discussing some preliminary succession planning. There's been concern over the culture clashes between the 2 institutions. Richard brought up an idea about rebranding the new conglomerate under a neutral name." Madeline looked at Richard. "A neutral name?" "Yes," Richard said, finally speaking with a practiced calm. "We believe there's value in starting fresh. A new name helps signify unity, not ownership." "Ownership is already established," Madeline replied. "You can rebrand it in neon if you like, but Eastgate holds controlling shares. If you think changing the font makes that less true, you're welcome to try." The tension was so thick it felt like insulation. Richard wasn't used to being dismissed, especially not with facts. One of the Sterling members tried to pivot. "Of course we understand that. We're only considering long-term public perception, branding surveys, stakeholder messaging, media rollout timelines." Madeline raised a hand gently. "I'm not against perception," she said. "I'm against pretense. What we say to the public must align with our internal policies, otherwise it's theater." Richard leaned forward slightly, trying to reassert control. "And what would your policies be, exactly? If we're going to sit under your umbrella, it's fair we understand the rules." She gave him a long, quiet look. "The rules," she said, "are transparency, accountability, and performance, not familiarity, not favoritism. You either bring value or you step aside." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Carl jumped in before it turned into another clash. "All right, well, let's take some time to consider the branding proposals over the next few days. There's no rush on that front." The meeting dissolved quickly after that. People needed air, space. Richard walked out without a word, his stride sharper than usual. Madeline remained seated for a moment, watching him go. She didn't gloat, she calculated. These weren't just corporate politics, they were power diagnostics, and he was leaking all over the floor. Later that evening, the team was supposed to gather for a post-merger dinner at a private lounge downtown, a gesture of goodwill, photo ops, smiles for the investors. It was all fluff, but fluff with cameras. Madeline arrived exactly 7 minutes late, not too early to look eager. not too late to seem disrespectful. She entered wearing a deep emerald green dress. Elegant, asymmetrical, no jewelry but a thin gold watch. Heads turned, conversations paused mid-sentence. Even the servers straightened their posture. She didn't need to speak to command the room, she just had to exist in it. Richard, standing at the bar, froze when he saw her. He looked like he wanted to say something, maybe apologize, maybe regroup, but she turned her attention to someone else. Marcia was already waiting near the fireplace, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. "You showed up," Marcia said with a sly grin, handing her a glass. "I always show up," Madeline replied. "That's the difference." Marcia chuckled and raised her glass. "To the woman who runs the room without saying a word." They clinked. The flashbulbs started as the photographers arrived, snapping moments of unity and celebration. To the camera, Madeline smiled. But behind the smile was a razor's edge. Because tomorrow she'd start trimming the fat. And Richard Langston? He was first on the list. The boardroom was colder than usual. Not from the thermostat, this was the kind of cold that came from tension, from the unspoken dread humming beneath business casual conversations. It was 9:00 a.m. on the final day of the merger week. This was the last meeting before the transition plan was approved and publicly announced. What hadn't been said yet was that this meeting would decide everything. Richard Langston arrived early, again. He wore his signature pinstripe suit, but this time his swagger had been traded for something stiffer. No one smiled when he walked in, not because they feared him. Those days were over. It was because they didn't know what role he'd still play when the ink dried. Carl Jennings looked like he hadn't slept. His eyes darted between folders and email notifications as he whispered something to an assistant, nodding too often, too fast. Marcia sat near the middle of the table, scribbling notes that didn't need to be written. She just wanted to look busy. Everyone was there, everyone but her. Madeline Vaughn stepped into the room at 9:03. She didn't apologize. She didn't need to. She walked in like gravity had finally arrived. Every head turned. She was dressed in crisp ivory with a black belt cinched at her waist. No blazer, no jewelry, just her name badge and the tablet in her hand. No one spoke until she took her seat. Not at the side, not at the corner. The head of the table. Carl began to stand, unsure of protocol now, but Madeline gave him a nod to sit. She glanced around the room. "Let's begin." The screen behind her flickered to life with a single word in bold sans-serif font. Union Bank. Not Eastgate. Not Dominion. Not Sterling. Unified in name, unified in purpose. It wasn't about who came in with the most money or the longest title. It was about who was building the next generation of trust in banking. There was a moment of collective silence. Then Madeline spoke. "This name reflects more than a merger. It reflects a mandate. We are no longer 3 companies competing under one umbrella. We are a new force, leaner, sharper, more aware. And we are committed to rebuilding the public's faith in finance through action, not announcements." She clicked once. The slide changed. On the screen were 6 names, the proposed executive board. 4 of the names were expected, 2 were not. Richard's name was missing. Gasps were swallowed, eyes blinked. Richard sat perfectly still, but the red rising in his neck betrayed him. "I want to address the leadership structure," Madeline said, her voice measured. "We performed an internal audit of operations, ethics, and culture. The results were illuminating. Some of what we found was simply inefficiency. Some of it was legacy." She looked at Richard now, directly. "I've offered Mr. Langston a dignified exit package, full benefits, 2-year consulting retainer, if desired. But as of this week, he will not be part of the executive board." Richard finally found his voice. It was quiet, but sharp. "You're pushing me out?" Madeline didn't flinch. "I'm moving the company forward." He sat back, stunned into silence. There was no scene, no tantrum, just a long breath and a quiet defeat. She didn't rub it in. That wasn't her style. She wasn't here to humiliate anyone. She was here to lead. "Now," she continued, "let's vote." One by one, hands raised. Some hesitated. Most didn't. The proposal passed unanimously. When the room adjourned for a short break, no one left immediately. People lingered, unsure of what to do next. Madeline stood and walked to the window, overlooking the skyline. Marcia joined her. "You did it," she said, barely above a whisper. Madeline gave a soft laugh. "Not yet, but it's a start. You're not worried about backlash?" Madeline shook her head slowly. "Backlash is loud but brief. Vision lasts longer." Carl approached her a few minutes later, fiddling with his tie. "Miss Vaughn?" "Call me Madeline, Carl. We're going to be working together for a while." He smiled sheepishly. "Madeline, the media team's waiting downstairs. Cameras are set up. They're expecting a joint announcement." She nodded. "Let's give them something worth quoting." By the time she stepped onto the stage in the building's media center, the buzz had already begun. Reporters were whispering her name. Some recognized her face. Some had dismissed her picture when it was buried under layers of corporate org charts. But now, she wasn't a footnote. She was the headline. Cameras flashed. The lights dimmed, and Madeline took the podium. "Good morning. I'm Madeline Vaughn, and I'm proud to announce the official formation of Union Bank." A few flashes went off again. "Our goal is not to be the biggest. It's to be the most trusted. We've merged not to create a monopoly, but a model, one that centers equity, transparency, and integrity in everything we do. Today isn't about a new logo. It's about a new legacy." She paused, let it settle, then finished. "And if anyone's still wondering who's at the head of the table, now you know." Applause followed, not thunderous but real. In the days that followed, headlines ran with it. Union Bank forms with new leadership, new vision. Meet Madeline Vaughn, the quiet powerhouse who transformed a merger into a movement. Former Dominion CEO steps down amid audit scrutiny. But Madeline didn't read most of them. She was already moving, restructuring departments, promoting overlooked talent, expanding outreach in underserved communities, reforming hiring pipelines, rebuilding the ethics board. Her name was everywhere now. But she didn't care about fame. She cared about foundation. One morning, weeks later, she sat in her new corner office. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a minimalist desk, and a single framed quote on the wall. "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring your own chair." She didn't bring a chair. She brought the table. And now, she sat at the head of it,